Welcome to the Leadership Bootcamp podcast. This is Jeff Strauss. Today I'm speaking with Russ Laraway. Russ is the author of When They Win, You Win, in which he details his data-driven management framework that unlocked the performance and engagement of employees at Qualtrics, where he was Chief People Officer, and other teams he has led and coached throughout his career. He's also worked at companies including Google, where he won a coveted management award, and the company formerly known as Twitter, where he and I were colleagues. Russ was a U.S. Marine Corps company commander in charge of 175 combat Marines, has an MBA from Wharton, and is the co-founder of Candor Inc. with Kim Scott, the author of the immensely popular book Radical Candor. Russ and I talk about ontological arrogance and humility, how measuring behaviors impacts performance at the individual and company levels, alignment among managers, executive communication, a company's mission, vision, and values, how to write a good resume, the importance of modeling good management behaviors, how to separate ideas from identities, and other topics. It was great to catch up with Russ and dig deeper into the concepts he writes about in When They Win, You Win. And now I bring you Russ Laraway. So Russ, thank you for joining me on the Leadership Bootcamp podcast. We really appreciate your time. Let's start with, why did you write When They Win, You Win?
Yeah, first, thanks, Jeff, for having me. It is great to reconnect. Smiling face, thoughtful guy, a real positive person in my professional life. It's always nice to get back in touch. So I'm stoked to be here. Yeah, why'd I write the book? So I have this belief that people deserve to be led well. And that doesn't sound like I just put a rocket into space. That sounds maybe really obvious. Although we both know that we've all been exposed to tons of managers who are doing this poorly. But what I discovered along the way, I don't know, 5+ years ago, is that the overwhelming majority of evidence out in the world, third-party research, your own sort of anecdotal experience, you name it, tells us that actually pretty systematically managers are failing and no one is helping. And I thought to myself, wait a minute, that can't be right. I know it's what it feels like is going around. And I know I've seen high quality research outlets kind of tell me this is true, that managers are roughly stagnant for like 30 years. But I said to myself, that just can't be, because you may have heard that the corpus of information around being a good manager, good leader is an absolute growth industry over the last 30 years. So how the hell, in the context of this ever-growing mountain of here's how to lead, how the hell could managers be at best stagnant? And it kind of hit me. What hit me was there is way too much stuff. It does not ever hang together. And last and most important is not a shred of it is held to measurable account. None of it. There's nothing. I promise you. And so look, I have this. Let me tell you, I have this vision. I have this funny vision. It's G-rated vision. That if I were to be able to sit down, right, and think of the thought leaders you know in this space, the leadership space. I get to sit down with these folks, and I get to ask them each, how do you think your stuff helps? What I think the sum of these answers might be is each person might say something like, yeah, typical manager, they're going through a buffet style lunch line, and they pull a little off the, Simon section, a little off the Jeff section, maybe someday soon, a little off the Kim's, whatever. And they walk away and they've got this tray. And I think in each of these person's minds, that tray is a well-balanced, nutritious meal. Now that's a metaphor for their leadership toolkit, of course. But in reality, what it feels like to the average manager is that they are hogtied in the center of a middle school cafeteria while there's a multi-thousand person food fight transpiring, right? You get broccoli bouncing off your head, mashed potatoes sliding down your cheek, all that. Too much stuff, doesn't hang together, not held to measurable account. And here's the thing, Jeff, if this book were my opinion, in terms of the things we should focus on as leaders, I wouldn't have written the book. The world doesn't need another person's opinion about what it takes to be a great manager. What it needs is to understand a set of behaviors that, when practiced regularly, measurably and predictably, lead to more engaged employees and better business outcomes. And so that's the book that I wrote.
That's a great answer, and I love that metaphor of the food fight. I like a food metaphor, so that's great. Um, this ties into my another question I have for you, which is, like you mentioned, most, if not all, of the books out there, particularly in the consumer literature, don't even touch on the measurement part, right? It's a lot of thoughts and feelings. And a lot of that, sure, it's good, but your book focuses the foundation on measurable performance. And I do think we need to make that shift into consumer literature. So, given all that you've said so far, why did you decide to make that shift and publish something that was sort of beyond or outside of the regular sort of like consumer consumption norm?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm a super intentional guy. And I'm very sensitive to conventional wisdom. Um, I am annoying to be around frequently because if you say something conventionally wise, I'm probably going to challenge it on it. Um, and you know, I'm not always the most analytical, but I'm hyper logical. So let's take a giant step back. Um, I can't stand the voodoo around leadership. So here's something that's a little bit fun. Go to a cocktail party and you roll up on a little conversation circle, and there's some guy, probably, let's be honest, standing there saying, I think there's a difference between leadership and management. And everyone nods and says, oh, yeah, leadership, leadership.
Yeah.
And I'm here to tell you that that whatever you think the difference is doesn't matter. And by the way, like the mental model is leader, leader. She is floating up a green hillside, a meadow, flowing robes behind her. She needs only whisper, "Follow me," and everybody lines up behind her, and they conquer the top of the hill, and everybody's happy, and that's leadership. Oh, isn't it? Isn't it something? Management. Ugh, ugh. That dude is in a concrete basement with drop ceiling stained with water. He's got a clip-on tie, a pocket protector. He's got glasses like you and me, and he is somebody to be tolerated. And dude, this approximate mental model that we all have is bullshit. It's we have fallen in love with the grandiose and the fancy at the expense of what actually works. And so actually chapter 1 of the book, by the way, is entitled Restoring Dignity to the Office of the Manager. I actually stole that from a woman named Heather Kirkby, who was at the time, I think she was like doing L&D stuff at Intuit, and she moved over to be chief people officer of Recursion Pharmaceutical. Really, really awesome woman. Because we've all tried too hard to go toward this leadership voodoo nonsense. And so then you match that up with sort of my own experience. You look at the corpus, it doesn't hang together. It's too much stuff. Match it up with my own experience where you constantly have somebody giving advice who is not conscious of the reason why that thing they did before worked for them. They're not conscious of, oh, that operating environment was unique, or, oh, I had some key relationships that made me very effective, or, oh, I had the single most talented team I've ever managed, and I was a terrible manager, and they all just made up for it. Like nobody's conscious about that. And so people are dispensing advice that they don't even know whether the advice is any good or not. That's the first part of the network. The second part of the network is the reception of the advice. Heavily subject to bias. People are way more likely to opt into something that sounds familiar to them, that they're probably already good at. And by the way, sometimes it's a prioritization problem. Like, I don't know if this is something I should pay attention to or not. I don't have time for this. So they don't pay attention to this thing they should. So this massive problem of conventional wisdom, voodoo, being in love with the fancy, this terrible lack of consciousness around the advice you give, this terrible lack of self-awareness about your own bias and the advice that you decide to pick up. And it's no wonder, no managers ever get better. It's a terrible system. We're not transferring tribal knowledge down through generations of early humans here. We're trying to help people become more effective leaders. And it feels to me like it required rigor. By the way, like I don't want to sound braggy, but I've been like a really good manager. I
Mhm.
won an award for it at Google. It's called the Great Manager. What's the thing I'm most proud of in my career? Um, Maybe second most now after my stint at Qualtrics, but it doesn't matter. I'm really proud of that. People loved working in my groups. Not every, but mostly people were real happy.
Mhm.
And I don't think that means anybody should listen to me.
Mhm.
We have to listen to the data. We need to uncover a set of behaviors that, when practiced regularly, measurably, and predictably, lead to more engaged employees and better business outcomes. So that's why we're into toward measurement. We literally, sorry. And by the way, the model is it's a statistical regression model, actually. I know someone with your sort of education you totally get, but just in case your audience biases toward the nerdy side, we took the concept of leadership and we measured it. We measured how frequently employees were seeing their managers exhibit these behaviors. We called that manager effectiveness score.
Mhm.
We said that's the independent variable, a clean signal on how employees are experiencing their manager's leadership. And then we took employee engagement, this crucial 30-year-old IO psychological measurement that generally predicts business outcomes, put that in there. And then we put in business outcomes like quota attainment, like lines of code checked in, like
Mhm.
Jira tickets, like contract renewal, you name it.
Mhm.
We mixed that all up in a big stats package, and we were able to understand how a dozen or so behaviors related to both employee engagement and business outcomes. And so, and those two things, engagement results, were the dependent variables. So this is kind of what this was the only thing I think I really invented in the book, is that specific model of independent and two dependent variables like that.
Mhm.
And so we eventually, as we started to run this every quarter, we had incredible amount of data. We started to see that there was a there, and because the initial set of behaviors were more of a theory, I could come back to that later if you want. Um, and we started to see that there was a there, and then the team got incredibly excited about solving this fascinating problem, and the team it became the team's problem to solve as much as mine. And yeah, we just went hard at this and understanding how all these things interrelate. It was awesome. It was an awesome, like, basically 4-year experiment.
Well, that is really fascinating, and I totally resonate with the sort of I love the statistical regression model that you're using to quantify these behaviors. I think that's really important, and that's been a large focus of my academic study as well. The I have a question for you about sort of your path to the next, like your path through your career to this point. But since we're on this point here, I'll skip ahead a little bit and ask. We're talking a lot about measuring. In your book, there are a few mentions of intuition. You talk about Google's acquisition of DoubleClick and how you had a hunch, or your intuition told you about some aspects of the time to live customer onboarding metric. Use a couple of other examples where characters throughout your book are using gut feelings to sort of feel their way through. In light of the model that you're just talking about now, how important do you think intuition is to a manager? And where do you think that plays in terms of their general operations?
Yeah, I think first of all, I think that there's decent chance that the more experience you have as a manager, the more refined your intuition will become. But I actually think intuition is probably more likely dangerous than helpful for many, not all. This is real tricky for me. First of all, if you were to get underneath the specific behaviors, you realize that the areas that might be primed or appropriate for you to demonstrate intuition is a gigantic set of things that may or may not happen out in the world. But if you take this DoubleClick example, I'll actually make it a little more tangible that you mentioned. So basically, what had happened was we acquired this company, and it was really clear that for a variety of reasons, they built a pretty different culture than Google's. And it was, and by the way, I could articulate this wasn't even so much intuition. I could articulate some key differences, and sort of chief among them was there were two major differences that I saw. One is every Google looked at everything through the lens of massive scale. DoubleClick actually built a business for acquisition by focusing on solving a lot of broken window technology problems with humans, the opposite of scale. That was the first major problem. The second major problem is culturally, the DoubleClick, the other functions weren't particularly kind, didn't really listen well, I would argue, to the service organization, which is, has all the customer perspective, right? It's one of the most important organizations to listen to. But there was a lot of mistrust. There was a lot of my predecessor was not particularly collaborative with the rest of the leadership team. There's a lot of issues there, and I could see all of this. Oh, and by the way, sorry, the reason that last part's important is because a lot of times the culture in that service organization was blame someone else. Don't look internally and say, what can we focus on and fix, but blame someone else. This time to live thing you're talking about, it's a story I tell where the team was pretty well convinced they couldn't do anything about it because all these technology gaps. And, we went through a process of saying, what can we control? Now, if I use the word intuition in the book to describe how I sort of analyze this culture problem, that's probably actually wrong. I probably am wrong about that because I think I was pretty. I think I nailed that. Then what I did though was so the three big variables, the 12 behaviors subtract up the three ideas: direction, coaching, career. Mm-hmm. Became very clear that time to live for that segment of the business, it needed to fall. And we were going to be the kind of organization that figured out what we could control. And we were going to stack rank the things we could control in terms of their explanatory power and gigantic, unacceptable time to live, getting the product live for the customer after they sign the contract. And then we were going to systematically tackle those things. We were going to cut across functional borders. We were going to go to the product team and the engineering team and say, fix this because it's creating poor customer experience. We're going to do that. I know you couldn't do it before. We're doing that. And so I was crystal clear about what was expected. Right? And this had nothing to do with intuition now. So I took an analysis of cultural differences, looked at an obvious problem, which is customers signed a contract and they couldn't use the product meaningfully for like 90 days. That doesn't make any sense. Mm-hmm. And so we just have to fix this. And then it made it very clear what was expected. And then had to make sure I had leaders who could coach folks through these roadblocks they had built for themselves and work through the roadblocks that their old organization had built and make it clear that I don't want to hear we can't do this because we never were really allowed or expected. I made it super clear. So the expectation couldn't have been clear. So I don't know. I don't like to advise folks too much toward intuition because I hear intuition, I start to hear bias. And anyway, but like when working through a problem with someone, I'm coaching someone. And in that coaching, which is one of the behaviors that you're supposed to do, you're going to hear something you maybe have never heard before, and you're going to need to draw on your experience. You're going to need to create a theory with your intuition that you then need to test in the coaching session. And so even the intuition, I would argue, let's make that more of a theory. And then let's have the discipline to go test ourselves. And by the way, scientific method demands we try to disprove our theory. And so we can't get too married to our intuition or else we're likely to exhibit a ton of bias. And so I'd say there's a lot of room there. So I'm mechanically almost exhibiting the coaching behavior because this has one of the strongest relationships with both engagement and results. But then within that coaching conversation, I hear things. I have a little intuition, turn that into a theory, test the theory, rinse, repeat. And then we eventually get closer to a shared truth that allows us to take action together. How's that sound?
I mean, that sounds great. I approve this message.
All right.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So yet again, you touch on some really interesting topics that I sort of want to dig into a little bit. One of the ones you just mentioned is the fact that within the scientific method, your goal is to disprove a theory. It's not simply to come up with a hypothesis and then try to prove it. In the book, you make a great point about a person named Alexis, where you mentioned that she didn't let her work define who she was as a person. So she didn't take feedback as a personal affront. And I've heard the phrase, and I like to use the phrase, people tend to make their ideas their ideologies. So challenging their ideas feels like you're challenging who they are as a person. How do you, in light of that fact and the fact that you just mentioned, turn your intuition into a testable theory, try to disprove it, make adjustments, don't be too married to it. And then also related to the fact that on when you were talking about the double click example, you had some of your leaders coach people through some of their roadblocks. How do you coach someone out of a mentality where they are married to their ideas?
Yeah, if anybody who knows how to do this with a 100% success rate should get like a Nobel Prize for something. It's tough. It starts, by the way, with there's a phrase that is a beautiful phrase called ontological humility, and the opposite is ontological arrogance. Um, Arrogance and humility get weaponized a bit. They're actually really useful words. Ontological arrogance is real simple. It's the belief that my truth is the truth. And so my method for this, Jeff, when I'm detecting this, my truth is the truth, my ideas have become my ideology, and then people become defensive. I'll actually take a huge step back, and I'll do roughly something like this. I'll say, I might even say, how familiar are you with physics? And most people are not particularly familiar. I had a rough time with physics. I mean, and I like science and math, but most people know physics is the area of science that deals with the physical laws of the universe. A lot of laws, by the way. And I don't know if you know this. A lot of people don't realize physics has a huge embarrassing problem as a field of study. It's got two competing overarching theories. It's got like string and then Newtonian, and they keep trying to unify these, and they can't. And many of the highest level, most important physicists in the world view this as a great embarrassment. And so you've got this scenario where the area of science that deals with the physical laws of our universe, laws in quotes, can't even settle on a single unified theory. You're going to tell me that in our little cross-functional problem we're dealing with, or solution, we're going to tell me you have the truth now? Physics doesn't have the truth. You're going to tell me the truth. And then the framework that I love, I actually got this after I wrote the book in an interview that I did on a different podcast, is the four truths that are around us at all times. There is my truth. There is your truth. There is the objective truth somewhere that's unattainable. And then there is a shared truth. And to be able to say to somebody, I understand your truth is X, Y, and Z, because I have listened very carefully to you. And I've demonstrated that by repeating back. Now I need to share with you my truth, which may simply be skepticism of yours. I don't know. And my goal here is not to prove you wrong. My goal is not to prove me right. My goal is simply to help us get closer to a shared truth. And by going through this process over and over with folks, you start to train them about this basic idea. There's not really a truth here. I get what you believe. I get, I'll tell you what I believe, and let's figure it out. And you also build a lot of trust. And so a lot of us got taught at certain stops, like you make your bones, you get recognized, you get promoted with big ideas. And so this is why this is actually tricky. It's why a lot of times I think people's ideas become their ideologies, because they've been rewarded for having ideas. And so anyway, that's this one's tough to do at scale, Jeff. But this is how I go about it in whatever my little spheres of influence are. And with folks on my teams or folks across functions, I'm setting a boundary of sorts that says, this is how I'm going to work through problems. I'm not interested in being right. I'm also not interested in you being right. What I am interested in us getting to a shared truth that helps our customers or helps us or helps the business. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. I generally sum that up. It's a great description. I generally sum that up into, let's not focus on who is right. Let's focus on what is right and move from there. I think that's a great description. I sort of want to shift gears a little bit, and I want to talk a little bit about this coaching aspect a little bit more, particularly in the form of more traditional learning and development functions within a business, or learning and development training that is presented at a business. In the book, you mention one of my biggest pet peeves, which is that senior leaders, particularly executives, and I have seen this many times in my career, seem to rarely participate in management or leadership training. They tend, these L&D teams or HR teams at a company will tend to put on these trainings, and they make it, unfortunately, as you are well aware, the measurement for success is how many trainings did we put on and how many people show up to them. So not the most effective measurements. Awful. But one of the problems as well is that senior leaders, particularly executives, I can probably count on one hand in the time in my career where I've actually seen them also attend and meaningfully participate. So my questions are, how do we reverse that trend? And the second question is, what are your thoughts in general about an L&D function at a company? Does it work? Is it worthwhile? Can it improve? Your general feelings.
Yeah, just a fun story. I was, the work we did at Qualtrics featured, you actually have to do your leadership training. You must formally teach people the leadership standard that is expected, by the way. I'm going to come back around and tell you why most L&D groups are failing miserably. But you must nonetheless teach the leadership standard. I think, by the way, in an ideal world, you're as aggressive about keeping out the flavor of the month leadership stuff that it sounds cool and fun and interesting, and focusing like a laser on an economical set of behaviors that matter, that measurably and predictably lead to more engagement. So there's a lot going on there. But we were teaching, there's a part that I teach right around the idea of improvement coaching, when you're about to criticize someone's work or their behaviors, basically, and how that always inspires a defensive reaction. And I talk about a little bit of actual brain physiology, your limbic system, which is more your emotion and your fight or flight response, versus your prefrontal cortex. They literally don't work together. In fact, your hindbrain will actively interfere with your prefrontal cortex. So I go through all this, and then I borrow heavily from an author named David Rock, who wrote a book called Your Brain at Work, where he covers this. After having read David Rock's, I was lucky enough to be teaching this to a guy I didn't know was an actual neuroscientist who made that slight correction. The hindbrain will interfere with the prefrontal. And so now you got it, Russ. And then David Rock goes on to talk about 5 social threats at work that people feel all the time: status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. So I teach that. Takes me to cover that all out. It takes me probably 10 minutes in a training, right? I couldn't get a couple senior leaders to attend the training, and I thought it was really important, and I'll kind of tell you why in a minute. And then one of the funniest things I've ever seen happen. So, by the way, 500 managers went through the training. They loved it, by the way. Like, it was a really popular training by and large. One day, one of the founders who was too busy, quote unquote, too busy to go to the training, we're having our company all hands, and he brings in David Rock like he discovered a continent. Like, this guy's a revelation. And I got 500 managers in the audience that are like, he doesn't know. We've all been taught this before.
Right.
And by the way, like, it's not about credit or anything like that, but how bad does that executive look? Because the executive couldn't take time to come and hear the training. Right. And they would have said, hey, I love that section. And look what I got. I got the author of that book here. And then on top of that, the time was mismanaged. The meeting was going over by 15 minutes. The author was the guy talking at the end. It ended up being embarrassing for one person and one person only, the founder of the company. He has no idea, by the way. He has no idea how embarrassing this was for him, because no one would tell him. If I can't get him to come to training, like, I'm not going to go kick him in the shins over this. Senior managers make a number of mistakes by opting out of these. First of all, I think a senior manager mindset is very wrong. They think they run the company or they run the function. That's probably technically true, actually, but that mindset is a terrible mindset. What they imagine in their mind is more broadcast leadership. What actually is most effective is to be a technically proficient manager for your directs, and then turn around and insist they do the same. Mm-hmm. That's the first major mistake senior people make. Most senior people are actually terrible technically. They're not technically proficient managers. Our senior team at Qualtrics, we got measurements on them, luckily, and so they could kind of see it. One guy came to the analytics team and asked to change the questions because he didn't like. It was unbelievable, But and then like one time a woman came in, she goes, "How many times do I have to say he's a bad manager before something changes?" I'm like, "Oh, we need to talk about absolute power." So we at least had that, but by and large, executives are unconscious because nobody ever tells them they're a bad manager. They also make this mistake that they bias toward absentee in the name of autonomy or in the name of the presumption that the people they're managing don't need much from them, instead of actually finding out exactly what these folks need. So that's the first major mistake. You're not being a good manager to your people because you think you run the org or you run that. That's number one. Number two is, how in the hell are you supposed to expect a certain leadership standard when you yourself don't know what it is? Close second place is, leadership by example never goes out of style. How the hell can you expect people to follow that expectation if you yourself are not demonstrating it? So all kinds of problems with senior leaders not making the time. They just couldn't find the time, and but it's because they thought they were good managers, and not everyone, but I'm thinking of a few specific people. They just weren't. So huge problem. Most senior leaders they have no idea because nobody ever tells them they're bad managers. Nobody ever tells them they're not leading by example. The number of people who ask me, Jeff, why am I expected to lead this way? And so senior person does not do that. I got asked that more times than I count. Okay, so that's a huge problem. So make the time, senior leaders. And I don't give a shit if you go and say to your L&D people, guys, we just need a more efficient version. We need to know what the ideas are. Even that, anything's better than just not going because, quote, you don't have the time. Terrible message, by the way. I don't have the time. And they're unconscious about usually how bad of a manager they are. Okay, so L&D as a function. I don't care who's the best teacher in the world? Gandhi, probably? I don't know. Okay. I don't care if you're Gandhi, your Gandhi level teacher. I don't care if you're Martin Luther King level public speaker, right, or you name the person you think gets stuff done through speaking.
Yeah.
When people go to a training, a really small number of people are capable of a really small number of behavior changes based on that training. The format of the training, like, there's one criteria, which is you must economically get out the leadership standard. It must be done. I don't care if it's in a video. I don't care if it's in a Google Doc. I don't care if it's in person, really sweet, swanky, offsite.
Yeah.
All those are fine. I like activity heavy because I think keeps people interested a little more. It's a little more, it's got more action. Prefer that stuff. But honestly, none of that stuff has any explanatory power in whether your managers get better.
Yeah.
So the model that I write about in the book is select, teach, assess, coach. So real fast, select managers for leadership disposition, not because they were the best coder or because they were the best salesperson.
Yeah.
Though it's a coin flip. If you picked your leader because they were the best coder, you're dealing with a coin flip proposition whether they'll be a good manager. Select for leadership disposition. If they have no experience, you're selecting for leadership instinct. I don't care which. Worst case, you have a conversation with someone as they enter the job about what good leadership looks like. Select one leadership standard. Then you must teach it. Like I said, I don't care how you teach it. I honestly think how you do it has almost no explanatory power in this problem, but it must be done. Those are done once each. You select a human being, you teach them once. Assess, coach happens ad infinitum. The assess part is by a gazillion miles the most important thing in this model. You assess from the perspective of the employee, not 360. Everybody hears me say this and they instantly think 360. Manager's manager gets tons of opportunities to evaluate the manager. I need one clean signal from the people that do the real work, from the people we are fighting to attract, develop, and retain, from the people who are the consumers of the leadership. I need one clean signal from them on whether you're demonstrating behaviors. This is by far the most important thing that changes managers' behavior. And by the way, at Qualtrics, we added 500 managers. They measurably got better over time. There's confidentiality, so people told the truth. We were real careful to design the questions around behaviors, so it wasn't so much popularity contest. Like, there was some real design thought to make sure we were getting a quality signal. Perfect signal? No. Excuse me. Very high quality signal? Yeah. And people get a dashboard. And by the way, when we'd say which behavior to work on, we would take not only behavior they were not doing as well on, but we'd also correlate it with engagement on their team. So we could stack rank. We could tell them, focus on this one behavior, this second behavior. And we never used it punitively to a point, but we did withhold reward. And they are not the same. Punitive is PIP termed because you're a bad manager. Yep. but you would not get promoted if your manager effectiveness score / your employee engagement score. So we made it count. And we had a culture where people paid attention to this tool because it was our tool, Qualtrics. And our managers got measurably better over 4 years while we added 500 managers. And our engagement followed that to a number way above the tech industry average, which is the highest engaged industry on the planet. Mm-hmm. And we cleared every business hurdle required to do a successful IPO. So assess, coach. So every quarter you get an assessment. We did every quarter, you get an assessment, and then your manager can see your assessment and you get coached on that. You don't get fired. You don't get termed. Nobody's judging you. And by the way, the more you do it, the more normal it becomes. Suddenly, most managers couldn't wait for their manager effectiveness card. You wouldn't get a dashboard if you had fewer than 5 directs because confidentiality issues after that. And so most L&D people are asked to do a job, and they probably do it really well. And it doesn't matter. I'm sorry. Like, I know there's 40 PhDs out there, someday they're going to hear this, who go in and they're going to be very clever and they're going to have really high quality content. And people don't change their behavior when they come to your training. They don't even believe what you're teaching are behaviors that matter because you don't have any rigor around why the behaviors you're teaching are the ones you're teaching. Yeah. You then introduce a new idea 6 months later, and then a new idea because the CEO went to some stupid seminar and leadership's now a flavor of the month topic. Like, it's all messed up in that regard. But anyway, what matters is I selected for this leadership standard. Then I taught it. Then I assessed you on it. Same one. And then I coached you on it. And I assessed, coach, assess, coach, assess, coach. That's how you get better. And if a leadership or L&D group is not advocating for the assessment side, they will never know if their work actually matters. NPS on the training, how popular it is, how many people went. There's some, they mean something, but they don't mean anything about how effective it is. They mean nothing in terms of how effective the training is. So I get a lot of problems with how things are done. Look, this is radical. This is new. This whole idea of measuring leadership. I don't expect a lot of people to know it, but I would hope an L&D person could hear this, and I could hope they could set aside their truth. They're looking at their work and their precious work, and they're saying, "Oh, it's great." And I would hope they could think, "Oh yeah, I actually really care about making a difference here, not doing a training that people enjoy." Yeah, I don't know, man. How's that sound?
And I think you've hit so many important topics. As somebody who studies leadership behavior myself, and particularly how to train those leadership behaviors, you touch on so many really important points. You talk about quality of training, which I think is one major lack within the industry. Is a lot of the times, I mean, you and I have both been to so many trainings it's a complete waste of time. I don't need to sit there for 30 minutes with 35 slides with all kinds of different things on them, and then people walk away. The cognitive load is so high, people walk away not absorbing anything at all, much less, like you said very succinctly, much less being taught the leadership standard that's expected. It's just some fluff that sounds good, or it's the flavor of the month that's snaking its way through the industry, and it ends up on a slideshow somewhere. The other thing you touched on that I really loved was, I tell my team this a lot. There's a great book. I'm sure you know the book. It's High Output Management by Andy Grove. Mm-hmm. And in that book, Andy Grove, the late Andy Grove and former CEO of Intel, made a mention that I took away from that book, one of many. And it is, the more, as you ascend the management chain, you become more obsolete. But I think there's a second part to that you touched on. And I think it's really poignant and enlightening. And the second part that you touch on is, while it may be true that when, for example, a coder or a salesperson or a designer moves into management, as they ascend the management chain, they do become more technically obsolete within their field, right? You all take me, for example, right? My career has been in IT. I'm a director now. I have a team underneath me. There's no way I can be technically proficient in every single one of the tools that we use. But where I do need to become more proficient is as a manager. And so while you become more technically unproficient, or whatever the word is for less proficient, where you have to improve your proficiency is as a manager. And I think that's a really important flip side to the conversation that's not explicitly mentioned in many places, It's just the expectation is, yeah, well, I can't do everything because my team does it. And you mentioned so many other good points too, like confusing absenteeism for autonomy. What a great phrase that is, because I see that happen all the time. So, hey man, if you ask me, that was an A+ answer. I appreciate all the insights. Yeah.
I think I really dislike, and I understand many organizations have to do it for basic just cost reasons. I don't like player coach. I don't like a manager who also individually contributes for a bunch of reasons. Reason number one is I think everybody, by the way, engineering and tech is the most guilty. They forget that there's actual set of activities required to be a good manager that take a ton of time. Engineering is the most egregious on this count, my opinion. That's number one. Number two is ostensibly, because most companies don't know any better, you were probably the best performing person on the team. And now what's going to happen is you're very likely to rob your team of growth and visibility opportunities, because the expectation is you do the best project or the most visible project or whatever. That would be a really great growth/visibility opportunity for your team. And now you're almost in competition with them for that. Never mind, that's dragging you. You lose leverage every time you go and crank out code on that project or whatever. Who's coaching your team? Who's making sure they're working on the right stuff? Who's doing the stand-up meeting? Who's thinking, helping them think through their career stuff? All the stuff that really, really matters is maybe not getting done, or not getting done well in all in the context of you competing with your team. So, yeah, it's a real job that has real activities that take all day long. Once you get to about a 5-person team. So yeah.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We talked about this briefly in our previous conversation, and you said it really well. And unfortunately, I didn't take a note of it. And I'm hoping maybe you have the light bulb flash go off in your head, your epiphany again, the way that you describe it. But I've told people at my work, numerous places as well where I've worked, that, like you said, management is its own job. And the way that I've described it to people is the work that it took for you in your career to become a proficient designer, or become a proficient programmer, or become a proficient technician, or whatever it might be. Once you move into management, the same work needs to go into becoming a proficient manager. Those skills that you learned coming up as an individual contributor, most of those things don't transfer, and you have to learn new skills. And I think that's a major, major miss that I continue to see all the time. So yeah.
Sorry, no light bulb on what I'd said before. It must have been a really great soundbite, but I 100%. It's clear as a bell. So many people have to end up being self-taught. There's nothing to teach them. They don't know what they should focus on. They don't know when they're told to focus on something. They don't know why. It's the whole problem I described in sort of laying out why I wrote the book.
Yeah. Oh, well, speaking of some of these skills, some of the powerful underlying themes in the book is purpose and meaning. And what I mean by that is you talk about setting a vision, creating purpose, helping people, or you yourself finding meaning in the work. And I think it's important that these aren't single-use exercises, meaning creating a vision and mission with your team and then that's it. You just leave them alone. You actually talk about revisiting the exercise periodically. So my question to you is, based on these skills, and these are skills that some people might not have, creating these opportunities to set a vision, they may have not gone through the exercises of doing that with the team. So I don't want to focus on the technique part of it, rather the more overarching importance of it.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the importance of vision, mission, and purpose? First of all, question, what are your, how do you feel about the importance? And then follow-up question, I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on this, particularly in our remote world. What are your thoughts on the importance of those things, vision, mission, and purpose, permeating visibly and physically throughout a culture? For example, you and I worked at Twitter together, and we had the 10 core values, Twitter's 10 core values, on screens all over the office. We had them on laptop skins. We had custom backgrounds on computers that reminded you of the values every single day. And particularly in our remote world, it's harder for people to live those values every day when you might not see them every day. So, first question is, can you talk a little bit about the importance of mission, vision, values, setting those things, purpose, et cetera? And then secondly, can you talk about how important is it to be reminded of those things on a constant basis?
Yeah, good question. Lots to unpack there. So, first of all, I advocate in part 2 of the book is called Direction. What underlies direction is a 4-part direction framework. First is purpose, which is really definitionally the reason we exist. And it's the longest lasting of the 4 parts, 4 direction things. Then next is vision. Vision lasts less long, and vision is really tends to be a big goal we want to achieve over a longer period of time. It's usually more tangible. So an example of purpose or mission, my favorite was at Google, organize the world's information, make it universally accessible and useful. Everything we did, we bought Keyhole. That became Google Earth, which became the satellite imagery for Google Maps that we all use without even thinking about it. By the way, buying Waze, they integrated a bunch of the Waze like accident and speed trap stuff is over into Google Maps now. That is all Gmail. These are great examples of organizing the world's information and making it universally accessible and useful. So that guided so many things that we did every day. Vision is more tangible. So my favorite vision statement ever is actually Microsoft's old one, which doesn't have hard numbers in it, but it is you can affirm whether it's happened or not. And it was a computer on every desktop and in every home. And I love that because my grandmother passed away a couple of years ago. She was 95. She still didn't have a computer on her desktop, and so it was a big vision for 1987 or whenever they wrote that down. But the point is, in that case, usually a vision has a time boundary on it, but this one didn't. But it still was a very clear vision of the world. Maybe SpaceX, for example, now is to make life interplanetary. That's the purpose. And then the vision is life on Mars. I mean, it's clear as a bell. It's one step more tangible. So vision is the hill we're trying to climb. And the reason it's really important to do is because a lot of times when you climb a hill, there's a lot of hills around it that look just like it. And you need to be real clear about what the hill is. Purpose and vision are the 2 long-term elements of this framework. And then the 2 short-term elements are quarterly goals, or I use OKRs, and then daily and weekly expressions of work, which I've stolen the word priorities, which gets abused. And I make that our priorities, things that are get done in a stand-up. You talk about what I'm going to do this week in support of my goals. My goals are a function of the vision, and the vision is a function of our purpose, right? It's a parent-child relationship on down. Purpose and vision, and I've substituted mission for purpose. Some people think the difference matters. I don't care about difference. I use purpose. I just like it better. Why we exist, vision, what hill we trying to climb. For me, those are critical hygiene for every team. Not just Zuck, not just Elon, not just Gates, or you name the high profile leader that is known for vision, but critical hygiene for every team. Core values I don't put in the same category as critical hygiene because most companies have them, and I have a reason why I think it's important not to deviate from those too much. But I'll come back to that in a sec. I've come to a realization the way we use core values is deeply flawed. And I'll come back to that in a moment. So purpose of vision, critical hygiene. Yeah, the worst thing you can do is take your team off site, develop the team purpose, develop team vision, and then never look at it again. But it's not about so much revisiting the purpose or the vision. These things need to be, you have to remind people of these things because they are the invisible leader. When they offer general guidance, when specific guidance isn't there or doesn't cut it, you come back to these long-term ideas of what we're trying to get done. You anchor someone's quarterly goals in those 2 long-term elements. I'll tell you a story that really gets it in terms of the meaning of work. Again, when I was at Qualtrics, I mentioned Google, I mentioned Twitter. I was at Qualtrics. Qualtrics is where we did a lot of this innovation, so I mentioned it a lot. I joined in January of 2018. We'd planned to do an IPO at the end of that year. I joined Qualtrics. I'm close with one of the founders. He had a substantial mistrust of HR, asked me if I would come in. I was a go-to-market guy before that. and asked me if I come in and do some HRE type stuff, but in a more operational way. I said, sure, that sounds really fun. That's how I got there. 4 days before our planned IPO in whatever, I think it was November of 2018, he calls me up and says, hey, we just got bought by SAP. Gut punch. Look, if I wanted, like, first of all, if I was really happy for my friend, Jared and his brother Ryan and his dad Scott, they each became a billionaire in that moment. And I worked very closely side by side with Jared at Google. He's someone I've always had a lot of respect and regard for. He's someone I trusted. He enhanced that trust when I worked with him at Qualtrics. It was awesome. But then I started to think, crap, if I wanted to work at SAP, I would have applied at SAP. Like, I joined this company. We're going to go public. I'd done it at Twitter. I was at Twitter a year before the IPO. I love that stage. Love going through all that. Love the accountability of being public. So fun, exciting. And so, I spent a little woe is me time. And then I thought, holy shit, the finance team, this was their Super Bowl. Like, these guys wrote that whole S1. They were running a call your shot. They're running a shadow earnings call for a year and a half or something like that before. And I went down and checked on those guys, man. And it was, in Charlie Brown, the kid with the cloud over. No, he's dirty. Anyway, some cartoon where a kid has a cloud and it's always raining on him.
Yeah.
That's what it felt like down there. And so, I got everybody to sign my S1 and thanked them for their work. They had a great leader. Their CFO was awesome. But what kind of became clear to me was the team was really missing a sense of like why their work mattered so much now that the IPO is gone. The purpose of their work was not for an IPO. A business is cash. That's what a business is. The value of a business is cash. We care about customers because they give us money that then becomes cash. And, it's ugly, but it's reality. Like, literally, the value of is discount all future cash flows discounted to present value. That is the value of a company. That a stock price is that divided by the number of shares outstanding. And this is the team that can tell you at any point in time, how's our cash? What do we need to do to get more cash? Where's going to happen if we spend this cash? The lifeblood, literal lifeblood of a company is cash. And these guys thought it was IPO, and so I worked with a couple of their senior leaders who were awesome and said, guys, we just need to hit this messaging a little better. Like, this job didn't suddenly change because we're not doing an IPO. They didn't understand the real purpose of their work. They didn't understand their reason for existence because they allowed it to become something false, the IPO, that when it vanished, they all just were hunched over. That's an FP&A team, man. That's not some huge team. That's not Elon Musk. That's not fancy. That's not going to SpaceX. That's being really friggin' clear about how important this work is as like accountants, lawyers read contracts for a living. Do you know the legal team at Qualtrics was the happiest team in the company? I'd say it all the time. They read contracts for a living because our chief legal counsel was the best friggin' manager on earth.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I think that stuff's critical hygiene. Core values. Core values need to be very, very carefully derived, and they should become the primary behavioral expectations for the company. So we get there's two things that we do. We create work products, code, customer service ticket, marketing copy, run the sales meeting, and our behaviors, right? Great companies not only care about what we get done, they also care about how we get it done. Core values, there's you should have like a respectful workplace policy, I guess, or something, but it's so low level, low leverage. What are the behavioral expectations for a company? Well, they're the core values. Core values as general fancy looking things, that are propagandized on a placard or website are one thing. Core values that are then taken and broken down by level in the company where you say, this is what it means generally, the core value. Here's what it means to a level 1. Here's what it means to a level 2. Here's what it means to a level 3. And then example behaviors, and then maybe even example tasks. And you make that a criteria that is evaluated twice a year or whatever you do. Not this stupid calibration nonsense where you create a brand new standard, relative standard every quarter because it's really about budget for bonuses than it is about actually helping someone grow. but commit to a friggin' absolute standard built around our core values we say are so important, and break it down by from level 1 to level 10. Here's what it means to put customers first and foremost, or whatever the hell your core value is. Yeah. Most companies, they go like, I just coached a CEO of a young company, he wanted to have an offsite. He cares about having core values. He's an awesome guy. And I said, look, I'm not coming to do it. I'm too expensive. Let me tell you how to do it. You're going to be great. He did it. I gave him, there's one company, I think their core values are the best written core values I've ever seen, Gusto. They haven't changed in years. CEO is very proud of that, by the way. He told me so this year. And I gave Andrew, my buddy Andrew, I told him, you got to go through this exercise. And then where it's got to go is these have to become behavioral standards broken down. You're too early for that. What he came back with was they were beautiful, and they're going to look great on the website, and they're going to look great on placards, and they're going to look great on laptop skins. Someday, I don't know when, but you got to take them and you got to make them real for people. And then you need to evaluate people honestly on those behavioral standards. Yeah. So now it's about what did I get done? And it's about how I got it done and my core values. So I don't mind the propaganda of purpose, vision, core values. Mm-hmm. But when you stop there with core values, you've made a huge mistake. I didn't know this back when we were working together at Twitter. I didn't know this at Qualtrics. Mm-hmm. I figured this out a little later, my time at Goodwater Capital, actually, that this is the winning idea for core values, is to turn them into behaviors that are evaluated and very specific and an absolute standard. We can change that absolute standard, by the way. But the absolute standard is durable every 6 months. You're not changing it. You're not moving it. And by the way, if we determine we're going to raise the bar, stupid phrase, but if we want to raise the bar, because nobody ever really knows what that means, mm-hmm. then let's change the behavioral standards. Right. Shift everything one block to the right. I don't care, but let's stop giving people this feeling that they haven't done what they was expected to do from a behavioral standpoint because 3 people around them were doing so much more, Yeah. So that's sort of my feeling about core values, and they could be so much more useful than they are. Yeah,
I definitely agree. I've done a lot of critiquing of core values at a few places I've been, and I have come away with this sort of idea that they should be understandable, memorable, evaluatable, and I call it irreducible, meaning it should be a very simple behavior that it's extremely easy for people to understand. You don't have to dig in to find the definition of, you don't have to worry about, is there an alternate meaning here? How many layers does this thing have? It should just be very, very, to go back. I still remember several of the Twitter core values because Twitter, in my career, Twitter was the company that had a set of core values that really sort of aligned with this, this ethos of understandable, memorable, irreducible, and evaluatable. And so I remember a lot of those.
Yeah. Can I interject real quick on that?
Yeah, please.
So the laptop skin I wore was communicate fearlessly to build trust.
That's the one I had in my mind just now. I love that one.
And here's what's interesting about that. It actually makes this example perfect. So I am lots of people say they're direct, and we've all had the experience where you're like, you're not that direct. I promise you, man, I am super direct.
Yeah.
I always joke it's the hardest job on earth is to be my boss. Cause you just buckle up. You're earning everything you want to do or you think I should do. Like, I'm going to make you earn it.
Yeah.
So anyway, communicate fearlessly to build trust. I saw that. I was like, that's what I want to be in life. So I slapped that laptop skin on, and, I'm generally not particularly sensitive to my reviews. I don't behave one way or another because there's a possible discretionary bonus. I literally couldn't care less about the coefficient on that bonus. I do things because I think they're right, because I think they're impactful, and I don't care too much about how the assessment comes out, to be totally honest with you. But it's always interesting from a growth standpoint to find something you might be able to learn. But by the way, going all the way back to the Marine Corps, I got very similar feedback. But what I got my boss at Twitter gave me feedback one time that was approximately in the strengths. It was, you communicate more fearlessly than anybody. You are our aspirational standard. Then in the areas for development, it was, but it doesn't always lead to building trust. And this was really fascinating to me. So my directness would sometimes leave a little bit of a wake of, bodies. And I'm it's more unconscious to me. I'm not trying to do that, right? I try to be collaborative. I always tell people there's no enemies in the building, but yet that my rather direct communication, I challenge you on everything. That left people not necessarily saying, "Oh, that direct communication, fearless communication led to trust building." Now, there were confidences there that my boss couldn't betray, and who or what. Um, and it was pretty relative to some, in one case, I could kind of tell like a really, really thin skinned person who, it was a relative standard being generated because that person was a wuss. And so, what it would have been really helpful for me would have been to be crystal clear. When you say communicate fearlessly to build trust, what does that look like specifically at level 8, level 9, level 10? I was a 9, by the way, around me. What describe that for me? Then tell me an example behavior. And if it makes sense, some example tasks. And now evaluate me. Because I promise you, that guy being a little bit of a snowflake was I promise you, I was meeting the objective standard.
Yeah.
Did I need to adjust my style? Of course I did. But like from an evaluation standpoint, it felt a little unfair. It was interesting. I wanted to learn from it. All those things. I promise. I try not to be defensive, but it wasn't fair because there was this relative standard was being created through anonymous peer comments.
Yeah.
Because they themselves had no objective standard to use to evaluate me as peers. Yeah. And so, and I just, by the way, when I was in the Marines, my battalion commander, I was a company commander, 175 combat Marines. My battalion commander once wrote in my fitness report, willing to wave the BS flag when no one else will, strength. Just wish he'd put it down sometimes. It is exactly the same feedback. Apparently, I'm never going to escape it. But it's not the point. Like, I'll take the trade-off here, generally speaking. The point is, communicate fearlessly to build trust had a very different meaning depending on who your collaborators were, where you sat in the organization, how senior you were. That's appropriate, but none of it was defined. And therefore, this relative standard gets created every single time that changes. It's different 6 months from now than it was, and that's just really, it's not fair. It doesn't really lead to the kind of growth you want within the company. The standard's unclear to everyone involved. And it's just a bad, it's where core values really, really, really fall down.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. One other thing that you mentioned in this example is the fact, and I didn't mention this in my couple of things that I mentioned about core values, but one thing that I find is critically important about core values is that you're able to use them in regular conversation within the company to build that sort of that neural connection between the values and the everyday behaviors and the work. So that's another reason why I think it's critically important for behaviors to be, or for those values to be behavioral in nature and irreducible enough to be able to say, yeah, communicate fearlessly to build trust. While you're right, there is definitely some gray area there if standards aren't defined in different ways for that. The fact of the matter is, it is a simple, understandable phrase that can be evaluated were the infrastructure around it to be evaluated, and can be used in regular conversation to help build the culture around the values. So I love that example.
Yeah.
I know we're coming up on time. I want to be respectful of your time. I do have one question for you. I actually have two more questions for you, but one question is,
I'm good.
Okay, good. Since you mentioned your combat Marine status, and I love there's no enemies in the building. That's another thing I'm taking. I usually say like we're all rowing the boat in the same direction, but I love there's no enemies in the building. That's an even better phrase.
Yeah, they're not, they won't, they're not, they don't know. I'll go get them on board. These are all enemy inside the building type phrases.
Totally. Yeah.
It's not, I'm going to go get them on board. That's my truth is the truth. I'm going to go talk to them. I'm going to understand what their priorities are and why, and see if there's a chance for us to have a shared priority. If not now, maybe next quarter. That's what you need to go to.
Yeah.
No enemies inside the building. Yeah. Go on. Sorry, you're going to ask something about Marines?
That. Yeah. I was going to ask you, can you talk a little bit about your transition from the Marine Corps into the sort of private sector, and How was that transition for you? Was that an easy transition? Was it a seamless transition? Did you have to like readjust your mentality because now you're not managing 175 combat Marines in potentially life and death situations? Like what was that like?
Yeah, I think when I was interviewing at Google, I was in the bowels of the Wharton School back in 2004, and Kim Scott, who wrote the book Radical Candor and eventually became my boss at Google, and Jared Smith's boss, the founder of Qualtrics. That's how that's all connected. She was my first interviewer. I learned later she didn't want to interview me because she couldn't imagine how a former Marine could know anything about the entrepreneurial nature we required at Google at the time. When I joined Google, we were 2,500 people. When she came to interview me, Google would probably been under 1,000 people. It was early, right? And lucky for me, the only two conservatives or libertarians or whatever in the whole company said, no, you need to interview this guy, Kim. And she reluctantly put my resume on the top of the pile. Also, they happened to have a Stanford MBA intern who was a former Marine who was doing real well. So this worked in my favor. But I show up to the interview and like things are stacked against her. She's real sick. She had to come down from Boston. She went to Harvard. She didn't want to come down to Penn. They didn't have any Wharton grads, so she had to do it. But I walk in, and even though she fulfilled her obligation to her two directs, Jared Smith and a guy named Hal, and put my resume in the pile, I walk in, she goes, what's a Marine know about being entrepreneurial anyway? And I learned already at this point that interviewing, for most people, because most people don't use rubric, interviewing is an exercise in figuring out how to exclude someone, not include someone. And so I instantly recognized this moment as a moment where I was out. I was out. I had nothing to lose. And I said, Kim, you mind if I take a crack at reframing you a little bit? She said, sure, go ahead. Now, it turns out this is her favorite, to her credit, it's her favorite thing on earth. I said, it sounds to me like everything you know about military leadership you learned in TV or movies. Would you say that's a fair? And she said, yeah, it is. I said, yeah, I can tell because this whole idea of command and control, this whole idea of yelling at someone and they just do what you say, it is all nonsense. You've seen some scenes from boot camp where there's a very specific purpose to all that. Or you've seen maybe a couple combat scenes where, there's not a ton of collaboration going on. Most Marines spend 99.99999% of their time not in those settings. And it's a highly collaborative. You have a job to do. You have a goal to achieve. You have cross-functional partners. You need to articulate a vision. You need to create partnerships with the S1 shop administration, with the operations shop, the S3, with the intel, logistics, all these guys. And you need to bring the perspective of your Marines into the consideration. You don't just tell them what to do. They have it's their team too. You think a senior NCO has been in the Marines for 15 years and I'm brand new? You think he's just going to do what I tell him, or you think he's going to tell me what he thinks? And yeah, there's some decorum, right? There's some customs and courtesies, but none of that stuff is how real leadership gets done in the Marines. So that's the first thing, Jeff. I saw your question in print and it featured a couple of these concepts. And it's the first thing I got to get out of the way is that everybody thinks military leadership is very command and control, tell people what to do. They just do it. It's nothing like that at all. It's very normal leadership. In terms, if it sounds familiar to you, they got to set a goal in collaboration with your team, and then you got to work with others to get that done. That's all we did over and over. Just so happened the stakes were getting shot at and shooting at others. Now, transition, there was one big problem I had. The Marines are very clear about an idea, and they mean this. As the officer, you are responsible for everything your organization does or fails to do. I tell a story in the book. I won't tell this story here, but I tell a story in the book about a Marine who went to Mexico, got in some trouble, and how I was accountable for that. Right? It was on the weekend.
Great story, by the way.
Yeah, and to give you a feel, like this Marine made his own choice. He goes to Mexico. He ends up drinking too much, punching a cop. And I show up on Monday morning and my boss says, I want to know why your leadership is so weak that this Marine thought that was okay. That's what they mean by responsible for everything you were going to do. It's a grown man who made his own choice. A lot of circumstances around that. The cop was trying to bribe him out of his wife's brand new engagement ring. And so none of that matters. That's to give you a feel for what responsible for everything organization does or fails to do. That is ownership. Does or fails to do. That standard's incredible. What I have seen over and over and over in corporate America is an unwillingness to own the outcomes, for better or for worse. always looking to blame someone else, always looking to hedge.
Yeah.
You know, we had a leadership standard that was, it's called loyalty. It doesn't mean you wear high and tight, you wear your scarlet and gold. Loyalty is very specifically defined as when I'm communicating to my boss, the mistakes of the organization are mine. And I mean it. I'm going to prove to you they're mine. The wins of the organization are theirs. And I mean it. And I'm going to prove that to you. I don't wink. I don't nod. I don't. Then loyalty down means you pass on even the most unpopular orders, they're called there, but the most unpopular decisions as if they're your own. And you got to mean it. You can't sell your leadership out, because then you teach your Marines they can do that to you. And you teach your team that you're a revolving door and you have no real power in the system. That's true in regular work too, not just the Marines. Larry Page had to have this exact conversation with his staff at Google, 2010 or something like that. Mm-hmm. You guys got to own these decisions like you made them. Debate them in here, but when you leave, it's like you made it yourself. Stop railing on the decision, Android guy, Andy Rubin or whatever, who would always scream and yell. So anyway, so the biggest thing I struggle with was how nobody is willing to just own their organization's failures. How nobody is willing to give full credit for the wins to the organization. That one was a little more common, to be honest. It's a little easier than the other one. But way worse was the unbelievable inability to own the unpopular news, to own the unpopular, to go get the information you need to sell it, to explain it, to own it, to give people what they need to move on. But everybody loves to undermine it because they're thinking short term, and they're trying to win a popularity contest, and they're trying to distance themselves from an uncomfortable decision. All feels real theoretical until there's a layoff. And then you wake up and you didn't know about it. And now you got to turn around and fire people the next day. And you got to talk about this decision. Your job is not to say, I don't get it. Your job is to go freaking find out the exact reason that we're trying to cut costs. What is happening? Why was this team selected? And then you got to turn around and you got to sell it like you were in the room. Yeah. It is one of the hardest things we will ever ask a leader to do. And it's usually at the mid and lower levels that are on the, sort of the receiving end of all this. Yeah. But I just to make it real tangible, that is the standard. Not, I hate these decisions as much as you do. Yeah. Is the wrong standard. That creates misery. It delays the ability for the survivors, they're called, to get going again. There's really firm understanding, for example, productivity loss after layoff for 6 months. Absolutely. That's why it's important to do it once and not twice, and 3 times. So anyway, you must own the most unpopular decisions as if they're your own. And if you can't, you got to go find out the things you need to find out. This is terrible in corporate America. All of it, all these things I'm describing are terrible in corporate America. And I have to admit that I've come away from the standard that was expected of me in the Marines, which is pretty absolute and clear. And I'm embarrassed to admit that it just wasn't sustainable when you're the only one saying, hey, that's all me. And then like the person that's your cross-functional partner, who it's also them, they're like, yeah, it is. It's all Russ. Yeah. Like this isn't really sustainable. And so I've had to soften that very extreme version of that. And I got to be honest, I'm not proud of that. And I'm constantly disappointed at how others around me are unwilling to own their organization's failures fully.
Yeah, I do know. And I see it a lot. And I'm sure people who listen to this have also experienced that. You mentioned one other thing I'm very curious to know your thoughts on. There's the concept disagree and commit. And I find that to be a big struggle with a lot of people. How do you, like, let's say, you had that experience with somebody, a leader that you were coaching or somebody on your team who is struggling with disagreeing, but committing to the decision and owning it like it was their decision. I love that phrasing, by the way. I'm going to start using that much more often, owning it like it's your decision. How do you coach somebody into that mentality or away from the mentality you were talking about, which is like, oh, I don't get this and I'm not really sure what's going on, etc. Like, what do you tell somebody like that?
Yeah, the first and most important thing to be able to do is to get the disagreement or the debate or the dialectic. I'd say that's actually the first big challenge because there's such a massive power differential between boss and directs that getting people to truly debate is a really big deal. that's the first part that you got to deal with when you, let's say you're coming into a new team. You got to create circumstances where you increasingly get people more and more comfortable. How you do that is you invite it. There's a very specific way to ask questions, which is you invite a challenge to conventional wisdom. You ask it specific but an open-ended way. I give this 4-step process in the book. And then you reward people for speaking up. You don't punish them in any way. You don't get defensive. You listen and you expand and you bring them along and you demonstrate to everyone else on the team that this is a team where your perspective is valued and your perspective will be heard. And we are going to have better ideas because you speak up. So you got to get disagree right. Most managers are not even conscious enough to understand how important it is to get that right. By the way, there are times where you don't ever get to disagree. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. You still have to commit. Like the standard is actually commit. But you asked about disagree and commit. I've been around enough now to know this is extremely challenging for folks. And so I am in those moments where we've debated, we've gone to the mats, we've put that idea through the rock tumbler, and I made a decision that I know doesn't sit well with, Charlie and Jane over there in the corner. I will proactively explain to them in that moment, here is the expectation to the team, and I'll follow up one-on-one. The expectation now is you need to own this decision as if you made it. And I'm going to talk to you about what that means. And I want to hear what you think it means and make that really clear. Now, I can't control what they say, around the water cooler when they leave the room, but I'm pretty proactive around owning that. I as an executive, I'm usually not friends with the people on my team until after we don't work together anymore. Then I have a lot of friendships like that. And the reason is because I got to do this thing all the time, which is I have to manage your mindset by owning these decisions. And I never get to throw the decision under the bus. And then I saw actually a circumstance where someone came in behind me and they're way more interested in, they overshare all what's happening behind the scenes and how dumb these decisions are. And boy, it wreaks havoc on people. It's the wrong way to go. Some people think it's real and authentic. They think what I'm doing, which is suppressing the reality of my disdain for the decision, they think that's poser. I actually had a person at Google. I did a speaking gig where I talked about this topic and a person called that inauthentic. Sorry, it's the right way to lead. But anyway, so I'll proactively coach people on what does it really mean to commit to a decision. You don't get to wink. Take 24 hours. Get your head right. This is our decision now. You had your chance. The debate didn't go the way you wanted. That needs to be okay. You got to respect us enough now to go on the decision like it was your own. You could talk about, we went through a great process to arrive here. I'm really behind this. Maybe even sometimes you got to say, because the team knows, I wasn't totally on board, but now we talked it through and this is the right thing for the team. You got to sell it. You got to own it. Get everything you need. So I'll coach people. The way harder thing we ask people to do is to commit when they never had a chance to disagree. The layoff example I gave is actually that example. And like, this is the actual hardest one. Because now you never had a chance to disagree. It has been shoved down your throat. Possibly, by the way, it is possible your boss selected the people on your team to be laid off. You might have a chance to affect that sort of last minute. But now your job is you got to go find out everything you need to find out to be able to convey your support for this decision. If you go and tell people they just landed this on my desk and I don't know what's going on, you've just trained your people to do that to you. And you have just told your people how powerless you are. Were you powerless in this? Yeah, you were. But do you want? Is that really the culture you want to build? You've trained people to go around you now. You don't realize how you're disempowering yourself by doing this when you think you're being cool and you think you're being open, and in reality, you're disempowering yourself. Yeah. And so the prescription is, holy shit, I hate this decision. I need to go learn everything I need to learn to sell it. My job is to sell it. I've been in that situation in the Marines a ton, and in corporate America a ton. Yeah. And it's my job. And so really, really tough for people. But by the way, this speaking gig I did at Google, it went poorly on this topic. It was going great. Then this topic came up, and it turned out I got brought in shortly after like a second layoff event in a very short period of time. Yeah. And things were very raw and people didn't like, and what had happened was I'm sitting there telling people you shouldn't do this thing. And they all just got done doing that thing. And people don't like hearing this unpopular decision that they had no say in. Yeah. But It is an impossibly high standard, and that is the standard. You got to own it.
I definitely agree with you. I think this is yet another area where that sort of management skill set really comes in handy. It's an important behavior and skill to be able to do that. And a lot of people, even seasoned managers, in many other ways, I'll say seasoned in many other ways, struggle with this particular topic. So thank you for adding some of your clarity and insight into that. It's really, really interesting.
It takes a lot of courage, man. It takes a lot of courage to own that decision that you didn't like or you just found out about or whatever it is.
Yeah.
It feels wholly unnatural.
Yeah.
But you have to understand the impact you have in the org when you don't do that. You ultimately disempower yourself and you create misery, confusion, anxiety, and stress in the team versus creating circumstances where the leader seems solid, the leader seems bought in.
Yeah.
It is a shit sandwich. We all can see it's a shit sandwich. And your chances of getting the team back on track and you leading them well quicker are far greater if you learn how to own and explain and sell the decision, even when you had no say in it. People just don't understand what they're doing to themselves when they undermine the decision like that.
You're absolutely right. And to speak about engagement, because the focus is on engaged employees, when you are signaling to those that you are managing either your powerlessness or your inability to get on board, or even your sort of your contrarianness to the situation, that's a great way to start to disengage people. So you're totally right about having that. Yeah.
If I could, one fun thing. So I had this thing happen to me at Google one time where my boss was Kim Scott and her boss was Sheryl Sandberg, who everyone's heard of. And Sheryl
Kim Scott, also, sorry to interrupt, the author of Radical Candor, who everybody has heard of also. Yeah.
A million times over bestseller book. Sheryl appropriately been spending a lot of her time on the AdWords business. We were in an AdSense business, which was a lower gross margin business, rev share with websites. We took the ads that were extra and we take dog food ads, we put them on pet blogs and we'd split the revenue with the pet blog website, right? Good business. We created a massively scalable one. So the reality is our team didn't see a ton of Sheryl. Kim was competent. Kim had hired a bunch of senior guys and gals on her team. And so I would do this thing because I was taught in the Marines. I'd try an international team. And so I'd go to Brazil. And when I'd show up, whether Sheryl or Kim had said anything about the work they're doing, because I know we're doing good work, I would say, by the way, I just want to let everyone know, Sheryl, Kim, everybody just really appreciates what you're doing. Because I know they do. Just because Sheryl never said it or I didn't see Sheryl that much didn't matter. Then I go to China, I say the same thing. Then I go to South Korea, say the same thing. Go to India, say the same thing. Argentina, blah, blah, blah. So we do one of these, engagement surveys, and there's these questions about your vice president, who in our case was Sheryl. And of Kim's 6 direct reports, 5 of the direct reports organizations were very down on her because they never saw her. My organization, the one that was not in California, the only one not in California, like 10 feet away from Sheryl's office, was very happy with their vice president. And Kim comes in the room, she shuts the door. She's like, what is happening here? And I realized I was doing this thing that they're supposed to do, which is your job is to proactively feature your leadership well, even if they haven't earned it. And I think the way Sheryl spent her time was appropriate. But to be very clear, she didn't earn the way I featured her with the AdSense team. She had no idea what was going on in the business, to be totally candid. But me passing that on to the team isn't, first of all, it's not right. And it's not helpful, more importantly. So I always brought good tidings. And it was fascinating to see this. And Kim came in like she'd seen a ghost. Like, how do we do this? And Kim, you have to create the expectation that our job is to proactively feature our leadership strongly. By the way, that Sheryl was awesome. That counts even if they suck. It does no good. You telling the team your boss or your boss's boss sucks does nothing useful. It only creates misery. So a big sign for me, and as the chief people officer at Qualtrics, I had this kind of visibility. When someone has a very high manager effectiveness score, but a low engagement score, that's a problem. Usually what's happening is that is a manager who is coddling and telling the team, we're right, they're the idiots, we know what's good and smart and correct, and they don't. That's usually a manager who's fomenting there's no enemies in the building. Way more interesting if you think about a typical senior person's interaction with an organization, it's going to be kind of the same. You see them at an all hands, you bump into them in the hallway. And when I can see a director whose team is down on senior leadership, and right next to that director is a team who's up on senior leadership, I know we've got a leadership problem with the director whose team is down on senior leadership. And I know the other director is doing the hard work of proactively featuring senior lead. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say I know. It's a theory that I can go test, but I could see this visibility. Like, we put together a 4-question survey when we got by SAP to understand how people were dealing with the transition. We learned a ton, and it was a lot about communication. The senior team was communicating the same to everybody in the whole company, and you'd see pockets where employees were down and pockets where employees were up. How can that be? What is happening? Did the messages not getting through? Are people not reading their email? Like, all on that team are not reading the email, but somehow over here, everybody on that team is. What's happening is the leader doesn't understand that his or her job is to sell senior leadership, to sell how competent they are, to sell their message, to understand their message, sell it, and to proactively feature senior leadership. I don't care if it feels dishonest to you. You got to think about how you can lead your team most effectively. You are not going to get senior leadership fired by telling your team you work for incompetent boob. I have worked for incompetent boobs, and my teams never knew I felt that. By the way, even when they figured it out themselves and they'd come to me to complain, I wouldn't permit it. It's not productive, and it does nothing good for your org. Eventually, the world catch up with that incompetent boom who was my boss. But it's not important to us getting our job done. It's my problem to deal with, not yours. So anyway, it's a really important idea that I'm really glad you brought up.
I mean, I love your take on not only selling senior leadership. I think that's such an important concept that, if I can be perfectly honest with you, I've never really thought or considered that in my entire career. I would never just in my own practice, speak ill of senior leadership to my team, right? Because I realized just intuitively, to go back to intuition, intuitively how unproductive and disengaging that can be.
So you would never proactively be negative toward your leadership.
Right. Exactly. But what I find so interesting about it's an insightful comment to begin with, but what I find so interesting is the measurement part. When you're able to say, hey, I see a manager with high team engagement but low productivity versus a manager with I think that was the measurement that you used, right? High productivity and high engagement, or it was engagement in something else.
So manager effectiveness score is high.
Yeah.
And usually employee engagement should be high. Those are so strongly correlated. But when I'd go and I'd see high manager effectiveness score, their team's giving them a high score, but the engagement is low. That's giving me a signal that this is likely a fomenter manager. Yes.
Thank you for clarifying that. Yeah. Manager engagement score and then employee engagement. That is such an important, and it's such an important call out. And the only way you get it is by measuring those indices. And it's so, I think that this, from a practical perspective, I think there's so much that was amazing to take away from this interview. From my perspective, as someone who's looking to put, I'm an active manager of a team, as someone who's looking to put something to the road, like some rubber to the road, this is a huge takeaway. Like just hearing that.
You got 3 choices at all times on what you do about senior leadership. You can proactively be negative. You already know that's a mistake. By the way, more than half managers out there don't understand that's what a huge mistake that is. Yeah. That's one option you have. Another option you have is do nothing. They are responsible for how they're perceived. That's a fine option. Many are choosing that. Wrong option. Third option is my job is to figure out what I need to know to be able to portray them positively, because it is in mine and my team's best interest to believe in their senior leader, even if the senior leader themselves has not earned that. Right. Boy, that sucks. When you can't stand your boss's boss, and they don't deserve it, and you turn around and understand how important it is for people to believe in that person.
Yeah.
There's obviously within reason, there's going to be people who know, and you have to be careful about being dishonest.
Sure.
There's a lot to it, but yeah, you always got 3 choices on what to do. There's other when This other example that was measurable, by the way, was evaluating senior leadership in one of these engagement surveys. And you see things around how they communicate, and you see one team is down and one team is up when they're getting the exact same communication. There's only one way to explain that, and that's through the individual leadership chains. One leadership chain, I've gone and asked, why is your team, do you think, because I got teams that aren't, why do you think, Lucas, your team is so positive towards senior? Well, because I explain, I talk. It's the first thing we do in our all hands. I sit with people. The other person's like, I have no idea why the team isn't positive on. I guess they just don't see the CEO that much. You're not a victim. You can't let yourself be a victim. Yeah, it's really important because ultimately they're not going anywhere, and you need to have your people the best that you can believe not only in you but in them.
Yeah,
and that takes work. And by the way, the worse a leader they are, the more work it takes for you to get them to believe. Yeah. So it's a really fun topic. A lot of people don't realize it's their job.
Yeah, that's amazing insight. Amazing insight. Russ, I have one final question for you.
Yeah.
This might be okay. This is sort of an out of left field one, but you mentioned one throwaway parenthetical in your book. It's one sentence, and it stood out to me as somebody who has prided himself on the length and accomplishments in my own career. I have had to whittle my resume down from half of a volume of a text to, a couple of pages. But you mentioned in your book, don't make your resume more than one page.
Yeah, what are
your thoughts on that? Was that more facetious or do you feel that way?
No, I mean it. Nobody has time for your bullshit. And so what you have to remember is, what is the purpose of a resume? The purpose of a resume is not to make you feel good about yourself. It's not to navel gaze and reflect on all your precious experience. The purpose of a resume is to allow an extremely busy person to quickly get a sense for what you've done. Your resume isn't like, people aren't like, you know what? I got this guy Jeff's resume and it's 4 pages and I framed each page and I put them up on the wall and I've really nobody's doing that.
Yeah.
And by the way, for me, I just assume, this person can't communicate succinctly. This person has no empathy for who is digesting the resume. That's kind of the first idea, is everybody, you got to just reframe, what is the resume? Who is the resume for?
Yeah.
It is for a very busy person who doesn't have time for your bullshit. That's number one. Number two is, by the way, as you take a resume from 2 pages, because I have over 20 years experience, down to 1 page, I promise you're cutting out fluff that doesn't matter. And I have some other standards. So I help a lot of people with resumes. Every sentence on your resume should be in PAR format, problem, action, result. If you can't get something to say in PAR format, problem, action, result, it doesn't belong. So here's a great sentence that never means anything. Managed a 40-person team. What's the problem? What's the action you took? What's the result? Not one of those questions is answered, but that's on every friggin' manager's resume in the world. Now, if you can find a way to weave that into a problem, action, result that you and the team took on over time, if it's important to show you've got some experience with a pretty large scope of a team. So all kinds of nonsense people are putting in the resumes that don't matter. When I graduated from Wharton, I got this exact advice. This dude was great. He was a brand manager, Campbell Soup. I can't remember his name. I walked in with my gorgeous 3-page resume, man. I was so proud. I did all kinds of cool stuff. By the way, I'm like 30 years old. 3-page resume. He goes, I got to be honest, this feels like more like an autobiography than a resume. He goes, I got a couple rules for you. Rule number 1 is never more than 1 page. I'm not going to review your resume. It's more than 1 page. When I work with people on their resumes, I tell them I won't review. First step is it's got to go to 1 page. Here's how you do that. You come back with more than 1 page. I'm not looking at it again. I don't have time for your bullshit. So he said, 1, never more than 1 page. Never. I said, but later in my career, he said never, because of these reasons I just said. Second thing, every single statement in PAR format. Most in PAR format. No, every single statement in PAR format. Okay, problem, action, result. Got it. I tell people this, they come back, they think they've put everything in PAR format. There's like 75% is not in PAR format. Great way to cut down the resume further by getting that discipline. And then last, he said, this will date me big time. 2004 or 5, this was. He said, nothing on the resume that doesn't help someone decide to give you a 6-figure income. Now, the reason that's important is because that speaks to how much more important it is for your last set of experiences than your early set of. So your recency bias on your resume is a smart thing to help get it down to one page. You don't need a stupid objective paragraph. The objective is so clear. Drop my resume for this job. I want this job. Like,
Yeah.
waste of time.
Yeah.
You don't need big address block. You need somebody to have your email, and your name. You don't need all kinds of nonsense about your education, unless it's highly germane, in which case figure out how to get that economically. And there are really good templates for handling this.
Yeah.
Someone needs to quickly get a sense for what you've done and why you matter, because they're busy and they're going through piles and piles of resumes and they don't have time for your bullshit.
Yeah.
And so it's a system for getting this thing. It's not just get it down to one page. That will be very difficult for people unless they understand that cutting out most of the stuff they've written actually is really good for them and for their ultimate audience. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree. You know, now that you're talking about it, it reminds me of a couple things. So you mentioned earlier your communicate fearlessly to build trust and how you've gotten feedback about that throughout your career. One piece of feedback that I've gotten for a really long time is I tend to be very verbose. You know, I was a high school teacher for a period of time, so I like to be able to. I mean, my wife calls it pedantic. I call it explanatory. But you know, I tend to be pretty verbose, and I remember I got this piece of feedback at Twitter where I would send out emails to my bosses, and one of my bosses, his name is Adam. He told me, "Hey, man, and when I read your emails, like I struggle to find what's important in there. Like, get rid of the fluff." So I went to the other extreme, and you know, at the time, the character limit was 140, and so I resolved to try to make my emails no longer than 140 characters, and like just get to the heart of it, right? Like minus the the pleasantries, minus the hey, good to see you, and thanks at the bottom. So I tried that, and that was an interesting exercise in really cutting out all of the fluff. Later on, when I was I went back to school and I was in a philosophy class, and we had a professor, our philosophy professor, let us take open note tests. Philosophy is not a small subject. And the caveat was you could write anything down you want, one page. And I thought, so people tried all kinds of tricks, and so did I, making, size 6 font, writing in the margins, writing horizontally and vertically on the page, doing all kinds of, filling in every crevice with something. But really it was about the exercise wasn't about getting the words onto the page. The exercise was distilling the information into what really mattered and getting what really matters extracted from the text. Yeah. So I think such a good exercise in so many ways to do that.
It's a really good point. So first of all, the guy who's the current CEO of CrossFit, his name's Don Fall. He is the MBA Marine intern who was at Google when those guys convinced him to pick my resume up. He's a good dude. He and I used to teach a class at Google called Email Haiku, which was about how to get the most important stuff up to the top. And get rid of all your poetry and just get it into a handful of bullets. I'll also say that there's 3 major management transitions that are pretty jarring. Transition number 1 is becoming a manager for the first time. That's jarring because you went from mostly self-interested to now your entire being needs to be about helping other people be successful.
Absolutely.
Huge and really easy to say, hard mindset to affect.
Absolutely.
The next one is actually managing managers. So when you finally just get good at being able to work with 7 individual contributors, now you got to manage managers. You lose a bunch of control. It's totally different. It's totally new, and like really surprises people at how different that is. Last is becoming an executive. I also I prefer the long version. I got some coaching when I was at Twitter. I was teaching a career conversations part for the book. I laid out the whole thing, and they hired a coach for me. Her name was Susanna Baldwin. This lady changed my life. And I got done laying it all out. She goes, "Russ, you like the long version of the story." And I do. I like precision. I value precision. When I was at Google, as you're coming up through the mid-level or lower level management ranks, you're rewarded for commanding your details and being able to communicate them. something happens somewhere along the way where when you're communicating with executives, they almost all have some ADHD problem, but they're busy. They trust that you know your stuff, and you need to learn how to communicate differently.
Yeah.
The executive communication transition is learning how to speak in abstractions,
Yep.
how to use stories, how to distill information down to something someone can access, and to bury the detail until someone needs it or asks for it. And so it's a really important change to make as you enter into executive ranks, is to learn how to do those abstractions, stories, metaphor, and distillation into very small number of things that people can latch onto, and then trust. They need more, they'll ask.
Yeah.
Can't do that in a podcast, though. In a long form podcast, you got to try to cover as much of the ground as you can, and hopefully as clearly as you can. And then ideally, you don't put everyone to sleep. Like maybe I have by now.
I hardly think that that's true. But on that exact note, Russ, I just want to say thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. You are the inaugural guest on this podcast, and I think you have raised the bar, as it were. We'll leave the measurements out of it, but you have raised the bar for sure. It was such a pleasure getting to talk to you and learning such much deeper insights. And again, Russ is the very accomplished author of When They Win, You Win, available on Amazon, available at your local bookstore. Russ, is there anything else you want to share with us? Or you got anything going on?
I speak, advise, coach, do a little training. Keep it light. People like the book. It's doing real well on Amazon, and and so I do that. But I coach a couple CEOs here and there, do a little advising on the people space, and then occasionally do some manager training and speaking. So if anybody ever has a need along those lines, easy to find. When They Win, You Win, LinkedIn, whentheywinyouvin.com, LinkedIn, things like that. And just on a personal note, really great to reconnect with you. Smiling face from my past, a guy that I trust, thoughtful guy. You say, Russ, thanks for doing this favor. Can't describe how happy I was to do this for you. And so happy and proud to be the inaugural guest on your podcast.
Really appreciate that. Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to record with you today. Thank you so very much.
Cool.